Hello and welcome to Off the Beaten Tracks. I'd just like to take a second right off the top to thank everyone who has subscribed to this channel and put up with me extolling the virtues of some relatively obscure bands. I really appreciate your watching, and I just had to state that right off the top. And I'm going to start right off the top with probably an obscure band. This is Hubert Caw. That's the name of the band. The band was formed by Hubert Kemmler. I'm guessing that's where they got the Hubert from. Limousine is from 1986. This is off their fifth album. By the late 80s, Hubert had left the music business because of depression. He made a comeback in the 90s, but had to leave again to seek medical treatment. Came back in 2005. He's a plucky fellow, but left again, and then came back again in 2017. Now, if you took a look at this picture, you'd probably think this was a band of kind of that keyboardy, drenched, new wavy stuff that was so big in the mid-'80s, the Orchestral Maneuvers, the Depeche Modes, and you would certainly be right. That's who these guys are, and like Depeche Mode and like Orchestral Maneuvers, these guys do stop short of that mindless, unrelenting asswag that some of these bands fell into. So this is certainly worth checking out, especially if you got it like I did in the dollar bins. Next, I'm going to talk about Sneaker. I found these in the dollar bins too. These guys, interestingly enough, were named after a Steely Dan song, which is Bad Sneakers. This album is from 1981 and actually covers a Becker-Fagan song on it. And here's their 1982 album. To further cement their connection to Steely Dan, Jeff Skunk Baxter produced both of these albums. I would say that the problem with these guys is they sound like a lot of different bands. Steely Dan especially, Michael McDonald era Doobie Brothers. There's just nothing on these albums, if you were listening on the radio, that you'd go, wait a minute, isn't that Sneaker? And I think that's probably why they made nary a dent in the music market in their day. Another plucky from the dollar bins was the Henry Paul Band. Now, Henry Paul was the lead guitarist for the Outlaws, and he started in a band called Sienna. He played, I believe, on the first three albums of the Outlaws, and then he left to form, ironically, the Henry Paul Band. And this is their premiere from 1979, Grey Ghost. I think they put out 3 or 4 albums, and then he went back to the Outlaws. So that was in 83, and then he left the Outlaws again in 89, and then he went back in 2005, but left a year later. Then he rejoined in 2010, and he's still there. I actually like this album. It's a little Doobie Brothers, a little Allman Brothers, a little New Riders of the Purple Sage. It's good, solid country, southern rock, and if you're looking for that kind of thing, you could do a lot worse than this band. Okay, up next, this is another band, Millions Like Us. I remember this from back in the day in the cheapie bins. It's still in the cheapie bins. Late 80s, I think 89 or 87. That's late, right? It's middle to late. Late middle 80s. This also drips of Michael McDonald era Doobie Brothers, lots of keyboards, and the vocal style is very Michael McDonald. And unless you're into that Foster and Graydon produced mush that was ubiquitous at this time, this is probably not an album you're going to arm wrestle Van Diesel for at the record store. Okay, now I'm going to go back to Canadiana. This is Max Mouse and the Gorillas. Now, I used to see, when we were playing the clubs, I used to see Max Mouse and the Gorillas posters on every pole in town. These guys were everywhere. I never played with these, we never played on the same bill with these guys, but they were everywhere. And I used to hear these guys were terrible. I think that's because They were playing in clubs that were full of bands like Steve Glimke, The Fictions, The Demics, Now McCLean and the Civilians, Teenage Head, Michael Jordan and the Poles. And these guys are kind of country rock, so they just didn't fit into that niche. This is their debut album from 1978, and these guys are still performing in Southern Ontario, and this was a nice surprise. I like this album. I picked it up about a year ago when I was in Canada, and I thought, what the heck? And I'm glad I did. Speaking of that time in Toronto and the clubs, New Wave, this is Toby Swan. He is from the Battered Wives. The Battered Wives were the wives sometimes and the Battered Wives other times. Their name was a little controversial at the time. And, but punk bands, new wave bands, they were supposed to be somewhat controversial. The Dead Kennedys were, it's hardly the Casey and the Sunshine Band. After Toby left the Battered Wives, I think one of the guys in the band got deported or something, and they broke up. He put out this album, and there's a new wave version of Somewhere Over the Rainbow on this, which was quite a big song at the time in Canada, and I think played a lot on, CFNY and things like that. I really like this album. It's got some really good pulsating new wavy songs. Times he's a bit Gary Newman-esque. Well worth checking out, Toby Swan and Lullabies in Razorland. Speaking of Canadian, again, this is Lighthouse. Now, a lot of people know who Lighthouse is. This is a compilation, a double album compilation of their first 3 albums. So you're not missing a lot. You're getting 2 albums out of the 3. These guys were a top-notch fusion prog band before they got into, before Bob McBride joined and they became a little more poppy. They were far more experimental in these days, but this is a really good introduction to those first 3 albums. If you can get the first 3 albums, pick them up because they're good. The first one can be a little expensive. This, I got it for $5.99 and in excellent shape, and I highly recommend it. I couldn't recommend this one, though, enough. This is One Fine Morning. This is the first album when Bob McBride joined. This is maybe one of the best albums, to me, of the 70s. There's just not a bad song on this. I bought my first copy, which wasn't very good, when I was in high school. I was in the high school radio, and a guy was selling his albums. Kevin Leacoff, I believe was his name. And I bought this and the double Grand Funk Live album. And it was a bit of a scratchy copy. I got one later that was a little bit better. But now I have a mint copy because this is sealed still. I haven't opened this yet. But as I say, this doesn't have a bad song on it. I used to go to Canada, and for whatever reason, this never came out domestically on CD. I know there have been some legal problems with this band. I think the manager owned the name, and they couldn't, even when they reunited, they couldn't play under that name or something like that. And it did come out. Oh, there is a CD that came out in Japan, but it used to be like $40, and that was back in the 80s, early 90s, and I could just never bring myself to pay that. But now I have a mint copy, and I'll be digitizing this, and I am a very happy guy. So this is the last, but not the best album of today, but maybe the most interesting story. This is Lori Lieberman, Becoming. This is her second album, and this is from '73. It was a moderate success. The songwriting team behind this album were Norman Gimbel and Charles Fox. And here's where it gets interesting. So while Lori was recording her first album with this songwriting team, she goes to the Troubadour one night, like in '71, to hear Don McCLean, who's playing, and he's touring on his American Pie album. By the way, the American Pie album, besides Vincent and the title song, is a brilliant album. As I'm talking about One Fine Morning being one of those great albums of the 70s. American Pie is another one. There's not a bad song on that album. Please go out and get that. So back to my story. So he's doing a song from that album called Empty Chairs, which is absolutely beautiful song. And Laurie's there, and she's absolutely mesmerized by this song. She's so impressed by it that she goes home and writes a poem about her experience of listening to it, and then goes to Gimbel, who is the lyricist for the songwriting team. And she tells him, I'm going to read this, I felt flushed with the fever, embarrassed by the crowd. I felt he had found my letters and read them each one out loud. I prayed that he would finish, but he just kept right on. That's right, Don McCLean was killing her softly with his song. So Mr. Gimbel takes that, gets together with Mr. Fox, and they write Killing Her Softly with Her Song, which is on her first album. This is her second. And it doesn't go anywhere. 2 years later, of course, it explodes when Roberta Flack sells millions of copies and wins 2 Grammys with it. And then the Fugees had a big hit with it even later. Helen Reddy, apparently, was sent a demo of the song, but she didn't like the title, and it sat on her turntable until it was a hit by somebody else. So Roberta hears Lori Lieberman singing this song on the in-flight music while she's, I don't know, she's somewhere flying around. And as soon as she lands, she calls Quincy Jones and says, we got to record this song. So in 1973, after the big success, Gimbel actually gives Lori credit and says that he came to her and, read this poem, which inspired this song. But then, I guess, he recanted that, and now it was a totally different idea that got them to write the song, probably because it would be very expensive to pay Miss Lieberman for the idea and some of the lyrics. Now, a little trivia here. Even though he didn't write very many good songs on this album, Gimbel did write the lyrics for Canadian Sunset and Girl from Ipanema. He also wrote the lyrics for Happy Days and Laverne and Shirley, and the hypnotically crazy H.R. Pufnstuf. You remember, Can't Do a Little Because You Can't Do Enough? That was Gimbel. Now, Fox wrote the theme to The Love Boat and the theme to The Wide World of Sports. And both of them together, again, also wrote I Got a Name, the excellent, excellent song by Jim Croce. But they chose not to give any of those songs to poor Mrs. Lieberman, who she left the business to raise a child and then was back in the business. I'm not sure what she's doing now, but I just thought it was a very interesting story. And again, thank you so much. If you haven't subscribed, please do subscribe, and I will see you next time with another load of albums that you go, where did he pick that thing up?